The Daleks are back, and they've been away for long enough that it feels like a welcome return. Something you don't get in the new series, where they're in it every single bloody year. But this isn't one of the best Dalek stories. There's only 3 of them in it, and they talk really slowly, so they don't feel like much of a threat. It's like they decided to base their performances around the stupid Dalek from the chase. The younger ones are much more effective, to be honest. Their makeup still stands up, even though their performances are somewhat variable. Jon Pertwee's Doctor has now gone full on James Bond, quaffing wine in between fighting bad guys, and having a lot of fun riding around on giant trikes. His rapport with Katie Manning has also improved since last year. His scenes with her really sparkle, with a chemistry that wasn't quite there before. Aubrey Woods as the Controller is playing a surprisingly nuanced character. He starts out as the main human bad guy, but it soon becomes clear that he's just in thrall to the Daleks, and by the end he's even helping the Doctor. It's just a pity they had to plaster silver makeup all over his face, which just looks silly. And Anna Barry is also impressive as a Nat, one of the rare strong female characters of the time. The time travel plotline is by far the most interesting part of the story. It may seem familiar nowadays through the Terminator movies, but at the time it would have been highly novel, and it gives the show a lot more depth than the usual Dalek invasion plotline. Overall, it's definitely flawed, but it still stands up as one of the more ambitious stories of the era. I'll give it a 7. This has always been one of my favourite Third Doctor stories, and watching it again, it still holds up. The medieval trappings of Peladon make it feel like Game of Thrones, though at the time it would have been more reminiscent of our horror movies, and the assortment of aliens makes it feel like the cantina scene in Star Wars, which was still 5 years away. It's that mix of fantasy and science fiction that makes it feel unique, and the level of world building is just enough to suggest centuries of history on the fantasy side, and a whole galaxy of political manoeuvring on the Federation side. David Troughton as Peladon is rather a weak character. His relationship with Jo Grant is doomed to failure, mainly because he's just not good enough for her. Speaking of which, Katie Manning probably gives her best performance to date here. She has a great time playing the role of Princess, and when the Doctor is captured, she drives the plot on, manipulating all the other characters until he's freed. The allegory of Peladon joining the Federation still works well as an allegory for Britain's relationship with the European Union, and it would still work today. You can imagine another Peladon story in which they decide to leave the Federation, and that would be a good allegory for Brexit, although that would probably get banned from the BBC. Overall, it's an absolute classic. 9. The Sea Devils still look fantastic. They're a really good design for a monster. It's just a shame they don't have more personality. For most of the story, they're just one-dimensional monsters out to take over the world. Even the Silurians manage to be more interesting than that. There is maybe one scene where the Doctor tries to persuade them to share the Earth with the humans, but it just feels like a retread of the Silurians, so thankfully it doesn't last long. Really, this is more of a showcase for the Master. He's had one story off, but now he's back. And there are some really strong scenes between him and the Third Doctor. The one in the first episode where the old friends just catching up is an absolute delight. And then of course there's the spectacular sword fight in episode 2. Unfortunately the rest of the story is just the Master trying to use the Sea Devils to take over the world, and forcing the Doctor to help him, which is just far too similar to every single story in the previous season. There are some excellent acting performances here. Clive Morton as Trenchard is essentially the Master's companion, following him because he wants to, not because he's hypnotised. It makes sense really. The Doctor and Master are meant to be opposites, so while the Doctor chooses pretty young girls to travel with, the Master prefers to hang out with ugly old men. And once he dies, we get Martin Body as Walker, who is a wonderful comic turn, always stuffing his face, and turning cowardly when the Sea Devils come for him. Whatever its faults, this story always looks spectacular. The use of Royal Navy equipment gives it a James Bond feel, with boats, diving bells and hovercraft on full display, and it's probably the best paced of all the 6-part stories so far. Even if it is mostly a shallow action-packed runaround, It's never boring and always holds your interest. Overall, this is Doctor Who as a big action movie. Not much depth through it, but it's action-packed and always holds your interest. 8. This was the only Jon Pertwee story that I had never seen before, and it didn't take me long to realise why I'd skipped it previously. It feels more like a story from the 4th or 5th Doctor era really, as we visit an alien planet, and there's loads of history and backstory thrown at you from the first episode onwards. After so many stories set on Earth, this just feels jarringly wrong, in a way that Curse of Peladon did not. The story is clearly meant to be an allegory for apartheid and racism, but it falls short in several ways. The corridors have signs pointing different directions for Solonians and Overlords. In the actual scenes, they're all bundled in together, so it never makes much difference. Also, there's only one black actor in the cast, Rick James, and he's absolutely terrible. But to be fair, so are most of the white actors. The look of the show is also a problem. Even by the standards of the day, the studio sets look remarkably cheap, and the Mutt costumes just look ridiculous. Admittedly, there are some good location sequences, with some atmospheric filming in the caves, but they just make the studio scenes look even worse by comparison. Paul Whitson-Jones as the Marshal is absolutely terrible, shouting and blustering his way through the show. Jeffrey Palmer is probably the best actor in the cast, but unfortunately he gets killed off very early. But Katie Manning does get a chance to show how much Jo has developed, as she insists on going along in the TARDIS, which is a definite step up from her first journey in colony in space, when she was absolutely terrified. Overall, one of the worst stories we've seen in quite some time. 2. This is really 2 stories in one. A 4-parter set on Earth, and then a 2-parter in Atlantis. And they both have problems. After an impressive opening scene in which the Doctor has nightmares about the Master, the show spends several episodes stuck in a laboratory in Cambridge, in which, to be honest, very little happens. The first few episodes are really just killing time, until we get to the TARDIS scene in episode 4, which, to be fair, has some really good confrontation scenes between the Doctor and the Master. It's not as good as Logopolis, which is one of my all-time favourite stories, but you can see how it might have inspired the later story. The final 2 episodes move the action to Atlantis, and just when you think the story might finally get started, it all falls apart. There's really not enough time to develop the characters and establish the situation, and there's a lot of frantic, Shakespearean bad acting as they try to catch everyone up. We do get to see the Master seducing a woman though, which is a definite first. The Master's assistants, Stuart and Ruth, make for a fun pair. He's a typical sexist 70s bloke, and she's a stereotypical feminist. Both are a little over the top, but they're fun to watch, and you can see how in another show they may have become regular characters. This is also a really good story for Sergeant Benton, as he gets quite a lot to do for once. For a lot of the time he is just comic relief, but he does manage to get the better of the Master once or twice. The monsters are particularly unimpressive in this story. The Minotaur is just a bloke with a bull's head on him, and Cronus is all flapping wings and filled mostly out of focus, so you can't tell how bad it looks. But I do like Cronus's appearance in the final scene as just a giant face in the void. It looks very weird and is definitely the sort of thing Doctor Who should be doing more of. Another high point is Jon Pertwee's monologue about the Doctor's childhood. It's a really sweet moment between the Doctor and Jo that really shows how close their characters have come. At this rate, he'll be telling her his real name next. Overall, it's a bit of a mess, but there's enough good scenes that it's not completely pointless. 4. So this season's been a bit of a mixed bag, with stories all over the quality spectrum. The Doctor and Jo are now a solid partnership, and the decision not to use Unit and the Master in every single story has definitely paid off. But the exile on Earth is barely a thing anymore. We're already getting stories set on other planets and in the past and future of Earth, so the whole premise of the 3rd Doctor era is incredibly shaky right now. And no wonder they got rid of it in the very next story. Speaking of which, I've already made the start on season 10, so hopefully you won't have quite as long to wait before that video comes out. If you don't want to miss it, you can of course press the subscribe button, or check out the link in the description for a playlist of all my Doctor Who videos. See you next time.